Good afternoon, everybody. The sun is shining here in Cumbria. I'm Gill Morris, and I'm from DevoConnect, and we've been working with Atkins on the series, and I'm your co-chair today. So a warm welcome to everyone who's joined us for our fourth and final session in the Atkins COVID-19 Road to Recovery series. Over the series, we have brought together an impressive and VIP cast of thought leaders to look at what needs to be done to rebuild and rebalance the Northern Powerhouse in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. As hopefully the UK shifts from pandemic and recession and moves on to recovery, the North needs to be ready to step up and influence policy and decision making and make the case for what the North needs to address prevailing regional, economic and environmental disparities, rebuild and rebalance. So we asked some pretty big and fundamental questions in each of our sessions on, the first session was on net zero innovation and what the North needs to do to unlock net zero infrastructure and stimulate a green recovery in the North and level up. Number 2 session was building back better transport and how we connect innovation and investment and infrastructure to rebalance the Northern economy. And third, and by no means least, building the skills and housing the North needs to scale up house building, retrofitting and placemaking in a post-COVID, post-Brexit world. So pretty big sessions. But today, and very timely and relevant it is, we launch the, ta-da, Emily's going to show you, the Building Back and Levelling Up report. There will be a link in the chat so you can go straight through it. So this is the culmination of those 3 sessions, and which sets out 6 key recommendations for rebuilding and rebalancing the powerhouse. Based on what we heard in each session. So very, very briefly, you can see the recommendations there on the screen, but you probably won't be able to read them. So I shall just do that very, very briefly. We say the government needs to accelerate and scale up its investment policies and plans to build back better and meet, if it is to meet net zero targets. Future policy making must be focused on the principles of inclusive growth, placemaking and connecting places. Number 3 recommendation, local authorities should work in partnership with the government as well as private and public organisations to co-design and deliver a fully funded pan-northern transport investment programme. The government needs to commit to a jobs and skills strategy for the North. Number 5, investment in housing and retrofitting in the North as a key part of a Northern energy policy. Getting planning reform right is number 6. It was a major concern. We need appropriate regulation in the future. It's not just about deregulation. So those are our 6 recommendations. I urge you to read the report. It's very easy to read and hopefully remember. And arguably, yesterday's spending review went some of the way. But big question, is it enough? So today, panelists have been tasked with the difficult task, or not, with commenting on our findings and recommendations. And each will give us their views on the big question, what does the North need to build back and level up? If we just move on to the agenda slide very quickly, very briefly, we have our panelists. There'll be lots of opportunity for Q&A. I want this to be as interactive as possible. Some of you have already put some questions into the process, which we will call and be ready to be called on. So yeah, what we have is we have a stellar lineup as promised. We have Piers Warburton, Chief Executive of the One Powerhouse Consortium, It's also working with Atkins and hopefully a report is due in the new year. So we're looking forward to that. Stephen Jones, who's stepping in from Bays. He's in charge of cities and at Bays. And we have Sir John Cridland, the chair of Transport for the North. We have Kevin Hollinrake, MP for Thirsk and Morton. I've said it wrong, haven't I? Thirsk and Morton. And also we have very pleased to be joined by Sharon Lane from the Green Job Taskforce in Tees Valley Local Enterprise Partnership, and also Sasha Morgan, the director at the Social Mobility Commission. So I think you'll agree we've got a pretty great session planned for you. Just quickly, just to make sure that nothing could possibly go wrong with the wonders of a Microsoft Teams session, let's just have very quick housekeeping rules. As I said, I want you to interact on the chat, get the conversation going. I'll pull you in as and when and try and include you and get your voice. We really want to hear from you. So that's the main thing, to get familiar with the chat function. Do think about some questions and who you want them to go to them. Use the chat and raise your hand function. And audience in particular, please mute and switch your cameras off unless we call you in for a question. And panel, please keep your camera on throughout the session so we can have some nice photos, but switch your mic off. And please, the most well used terms on these occasions is please unmute. Check you're unmuted, and we'll be with you. For the audience out there, please use your hashtag Atkins Recovery Series and at Atkins Global and at DevoConnect, and we will be tweeting throughout. So that's enough of that, and let's get started. I'm delighted that so many policy influencers and business leaders have been able to join us on the way, but also to generate the debate today, give us their thoughts on our findings and recommendations, and even more delighted to welcome my co-chair for today's session, who is Richard Robinson, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Atkins UK and Europe, and who will kick off today's findings session. So Richard, welcome, and over to you.
Gill, thank you. What a great introduction. Thank you very much. It's great to be here today and obviously to be joined by such an esteemed panel, and I can see so many other great people who've joined the webinar today. I've been really looking forward to this event as we dissect some of the key findings and recommendations set out in our Building Back and Levelling Up report that Gill referred to a moment ago. We hope the recommendations set out in the report and discussed today will help guide inclusive investment and policy decisions, which will benefit both the North and indeed the entire UK. And of course, yesterday's comprehensive spending review and the published National Infrastructure Strategy also provide us with much to mull over, including a £4 billion levelling up fund to support economic recovery, an infrastructure bank based in the North, and a commitment to an integrated rail plan to ensure that Phase 2B of HS2, something formerly close to my heart, Northern Powerhouse Rail and other planned rail investments are scoped and delivered in an integrated way. No small task. Overall, I was encouraged by what was announced, but only time will tell how the plans and pledges pan out for the regions, towns and cities and the Northern Powerhouse overall. Atkins has had a strong presence in the North for many years, working with local authorities and combined authorities to deliver the infrastructure needed to drive growth and productivity. We've really enjoyed working with clients across multiple sectors, including transport, property, education, energy, defence, and I'm very proud of the projects and the partnerships that we've forged with many of you on this call. On a personal note, I do have a northern card to play. My hometown is York. I worked in the northeast for ICI in the Middlesbrough area, Teesside area for around 10 years. And the last thing I did actually before lockdown 2 was to spend time and go and visit the South Tees Development Corporation, who we're doing some work for, and see the amazing transformation potential of the old steelworks site on the south bank of the river there, which has just plans to bring back 4,500 acres of land back into economic use. A really incredible project across all the things actually that we recommend in our report. I can see all of those themes in there, which was wonderful to see up close. I also, during lockdown, embarked on a virtual tour of the North in the last week, meeting many of our colleagues and clients to discuss the importance of investment in skills, people, infrastructure, and what it all means post COVID-19 in the UK, and how Atkins can help. I even got an invitation in to hopefully go and see a submarine being built, which is a personal ambition actually. And it's this that brings us here today to share opinions and insight with a focus on the North's role in building back better and the opportunity to address regional disparities which have become all the more apparent during the crisis. We hope the recommendations set out in our report and discussed today will help guide this and the decisions and benefit the North. We'll be looking at skills, transport, placemaking, the government's net zero targets, and talking through the recommendations which will be sent to our government contacts for their consideration. This is an incredible opportunity to break free from old ideas, and we're holding us back and really accelerate the levelling up journey. So with that said, I'd like to kick off the panel discussion. I think you're going to love to hear from the panel. And so we'll start with a question for Piers Warburton, Chief Executive One Powerhouse Consortium, and Stephen Jones, Co-Director of the Cities and Local Growth Unit, Department of Bays. And the question is, Piers, if we are to accelerate and scale up to meet net zero targets and build back better, what kind of schemes will have the greatest impact, in your opinion, improve confidence and prioritise green jobs, skills, transport and housing?
Thank you very much, Richard. It's a great pleasure to be with you today, and my congratulations on the report. I think it's very comprehensive. The net zero space is highly relevant to us within the widest possible context of the mega region. So we're going to be talking about the North specifically, but it's really obviously the mega region that we're focusing on because of our interest in spatial planning. And I'll come on to spatial planning at the end of my comments. The whole systems approach, which you mentioned in your report, is a great way to start, but it might be a little ambitious. And if we look at housing alone, housing, the biggest contributor to carbon emissions is gas boilers, of course, and gas boilers will need to be changed over time. That will be very expensive and will require a great deal of political will. There is the option of building smart energy saving homes, but as we know, they're much more expensive than regular homes, and putting brakes on house building is not something that the UK PLC and the government want to see. So a percentage, I like playing golf, and I often try and play percentage golf. It's a bit more better than trying to get par every time. And I think when we're looking at this housing dimension within net zero, I think it's probably better to look at ways of getting to 75% rather than 100%. Hydrogen is there. It's not proven yet for domestic use. And district heat networks have been talked about as well. Again, that's going to take quite a lot of local political will. So I think that's the whole systems approach. In terms of working together, I liked in your report, I like the thought that the community coming together, not just on a city basis, but on a pan-regional basis, that is central to our recommendations, because we are looking at spatial planning for the mega regions. So the mega regions of England would be the North, the Midlands, the Southeast and the Southwest. I believe there is a considerable amount of political mileage in this, as you suggest in your report. I think if you sell the idea of working together towards, because if you ask people in polls, they all say, yes, we want net zero. Of course they do. They also want, a limitless NHS. That's what they tell pollsters. However, the reality is that people will have to come together. I think it'll appeal to people if there is a message from local governments, and the protagonists within the mega regions to work together on specific schemes. I see great mileage in that, and I think that's something that you might want to press your government contacts over. Cross-industrial innovation you also talk about with net zero. For me, the highest function of government is to facilitate, and intelligent, realistic policy, regulation, incentives and taxation can go a great deal to achieving these kinds of things. Again, people want to do the right thing, but it has to be focused effort. That's the key, and that is where spatial planning really helps on a regional basis. Focused effort is what got us all those medals in the Olympics. It's a tried and trusted approach. The North actually is very well catered for in terms of sectoral excellence. There's the National Centre for Energy Systems Integration and the Centre for Renewable Engineering, both in the North, and there are also clusters for nuclear, the grid and hydrogen. All of these things are hugely positive. I think that the Dominic Cummings' favourite goal is an ARPA for the UK, and I know that there is a lot of lobbying from the research universities to go for an ARPA style entity here in the UK. That has my personally 100% backing. I think it's a perfectly sensible suggestion. We have a very long track record of world-changing scientific innovation, from splitting the atom to graphene. So this seems to me to be a very useful exercise for an advanced economy like ours. Again, carbon capture and storage. We are somewhat at the foothills of this, as we know. There is the Tata Drax carbon recycling unit in Northwich, and there's also a lot of international oil companies are looking at Teesside and Humber for pumping the carbon into empty wells. That seems to me a perfectly sensible idea. There's potentially enormous employment opportunities there, as well as being the right thing to do. Natural capital you talk about, for me, that's an absolute open door. Preserving and maintaining our open spaces, which the North, of course, has in abundance, is good for mental health. It's good for physical fitness. It's good for potentially employment. I think that I was going to say exploitation. That is entirely the wrong word, but a systematic approach to developing our open spaces right across the UK, but particularly in the North, seems to me a very sensible thing to do. Then that brings me on to spatial planning in the mega regions. As I say, spatial planning is, in my opinion, the way I express it, is focused effort. We have not really used spatial planning for the regions of England. We have used spatial planning for the home nations and London, and it has been very successful, particularly for London and Scotland. London and Scotland, well, and the home nations, need spatial planning because of their devolution settlements. Our suggestion at One Powerhouse is that we create, which we have done along with Atkins and other globally recognized consultancies, create spatial plans, or at least draft spatial plans for the 4 mega regions of England. This is a tried and trusted methodology, as many of the participants here today will know. The Rhine-Ruhr and the Randstad and the New York Regional Association are all hugely successful examples of spatial planning. We believe that we are already talking to Number 10 about the possibility of taking our draft blueprints for spatial plans forward to the next level. That will, of course, cost many millions of pounds, but in government spending terms, the payback, we think, will be enormous. We've also made recommendations, which we'll be announcing to the waiting world in January, for how spatial plans can be implemented. Of course, we have regional inequality. Quite apart from economic development, we have regional inequality, which has been very persistent throughout many years for many reasons. It's in some respects everybody's fault and nobody's fault. But with the right local representation, we think growth boards, which you could call a development corporation, but we call them growth boards, made up of LEPs, local authority leaders, and representative groups from that region, with a chairman. The chairman is then responsible to a Secretary of State, is the way forward. So that, I hope, covers off the main points. I'm very happy to come back with some supplementaries as and when.
Piers, thank you. No, that's certainly very comprehensive. So much appreciated. I'm sure by everyone. Stephen, would you like to make some comments on what you think would be the question was around what schemes would accelerate us towards net zero the fastest?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Richard, and thanks very much for the opportunity to join the panel. As the Director in Government with responsibility for the Northern Powerhouse, it's nice when reports land on your desk that sort of do your job for you. So we are very grateful for the work that has gone into gathering the report and look forward to kind of engaging with the detail as we go forward. On the question of net zero, it's incredibly timely, really, the recommendations here, in that what were only a week or so ago when the Prime Minister set out our 10-point plan to net zero. Yesterday, spending review followed through with that on a number of big investment things, both in the kind of energy space, in transport space, in some of the science. So, funding for ARPA was announced yesterday, and sort of very much building on from Piers in terms of within the North. I think the sort of Piers particularly highlighted many of the sort of domestic aspects, and I won't sort of repeat them. I think I'll just focus a bit on the kind of industrial opportunities. And so the Prime Minister was talking about a kind of green industrial revolution. We know the North was very much the beating heart of the original industrial revolution, and I think is incredibly well placed to be so again in the green industrial revolution. I think we're just coming up to a year ago when the Northern Powerhouse 11, the 11 local enterprise partnerships across the North, published a report about energy and clean growth in the North, which I thought particularly encapsulated the kind of points Piers was referencing to about the importance of collaboration over big scale. And so if we're thinking about kind of sort of renewable energy production, the kind of opportunities in offshore wind that are in sort of off the northeast coast, off the Yorkshire coast and out from the Humber in the northwest, there are similarities. There's opportunities to kind of share best practice, do investment at scale. Similarly, if we think about nuclear, the kind of the engineering and the technical expertise and the kind of steel production that goes on in South Yorkshire, coupled then with the actual, the opportunities of deployment in around Cumbria and elsewhere, the kind of there is a sort of system in kind of sort of decarbonising the energy production that actually is taking a whole of North scale, provides real opportunity in looking at. Equally then, just in kind of decarbonising heavy energy using industry, we know particularly along our estuaries of our major rivers of the North is some of our clusters of real heavy energy use industries, and so the kind of technology of carbon capture, usage and storage, and hydrogen and kind of communal heat and those dimensions. To take Piers' example, they're the equivalents of getting the driver out the bag on the tee and really going for it. And I think the chance to really make progress, not just to the benefit of those industries in the North and preserving kind of long-term jobs and opportunities, but also then to demonstrate the technology works and export it and think about the kind of being at the centre of kind of decarbonising heavy industry across the globe. The North can be very much a leader in that space. So there's plenty of opportunities in kind of both energy production and decarbonisation of heavy industry. Finally, the sort of other bit we haven't touched upon, which we'll come back to, I'm sure, in the next section, is the role in decarbonising transport. And I think that's partly about making sure our new transport investment is done in a sustainable way and sort of factors in, but equally that there are opportunities in how kind of particularly in production and manufacturing for moving to kind of electric vehicles. The Prime Minister set out an ambitious target for taking out sort of petrol engines from the road. To do that, we need to be producing a hell of a lot more electric vehicles. We know, for example, in the kind of Nissan site in Sunderland, there is capacity, there's capability within the north of England. And so actually, how do we think about decarbonising our transport network, and the manufacturing opportunities that come from that, I think, are really key. So there's a real, overall, there's lots of opportunity in this space. The kind of commitment that sort of the kind of we in government and others will show to this agenda sort of presents real tangible chances, not just to meet our sort of the necessity and our the need for environmental reasons, but there is kind of growth, there's innovation, there's jobs, there's opportunities right across the north, and particularly for the north to work together on those issues. So I'm really encouraged by where we are at the moment and where we can be in this space.
Stephen, thank you very much. There's a lot of interesting things there, isn't there? And I think just from what the sort of things that Piers touched on as well, what struck me when I visited the South Tees Development Corp was plans that are there and can be turned into reality quite quickly around hydrogen loading for trains, carbon capture and storage, demonstrating actual scale, not just demonstration scale, full scale plant, wind turbine manufacture and ability to deploy it through a deep water port. So I think some of these things are a lot nearer certainly than I anticipated when I visited the site, and it was really quite exciting to see how it could that all of those things could be really brought to reality for the, as you say, for the the green industrial revolution in the north. So that really caught my attention. So a lot of parallels with the things you raise. Stephen, Piers, thank you very much. I'd like to introduce now Sir John Cridland, Chairman of Transport for the North, who will respond to part 2 of the report, Building Back Better Transport, and give his thoughts on the key question he has been posed. So, Sir John, over to you. Is it time for the North's passengers and businesses to benefit from a more connected, integrated and subsidised transport system? I think that's possibly leading the witness, but we'll
unmute.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that, and congratulations on your report. I think the answer to your question is a pretty emphatic and easy yes. Why is perhaps the more pertinent point that you're pressing me to address. And there's a couple of obvious there. The first is that we're dealing with decades of underinvestment in infrastructure in the north. Nobody's fault, but it's just happened. It happened when decision making was too centralised in London. Now that we have the right to come up with our own proposals in the north, I think we're seeing a different focus, a different lens. And I'm going to artificially present 2 extremes. I think the old way of doing things focused on links to London and north-south links, which for the north of England are generally pretty good, our motorways and our principal north-south railways, but didn't focus on east-west links across the Pennines, which are much more difficult, much more expensive. But why are they important? Well, they're important for 2 reasons. First of all, they play to the agenda that Piers and Stephen have just talked about, an industrial strategy agenda. What we need to do much more intelligently than I think we've managed in the past is connect up our economic assets, connect up the ports, connect up the supply chains and value chains and labour markets of our major industrial sites. And that just changes the way you look at the north of England. So you might, for example, want better links between Sheffield and Cumbria, because both ends of that spectrum, that L-shaped corridor, a growth corridor, have nuclear competence, and both ends have advanced manufacturing competence. But it's not a passenger corridor that DFT or TF or the HMT would recognise in traditional terms of people movements, but it is actually an economic connectivity corridor. The second reason I think east-west links are increasingly important is because it's about opportunities for northern citizens. Allow me to focus particularly on opportunities for young people. I've reached an age where I'm increasingly interested in opportunities for older people. But my point on young people would be, I want a young person in Bradford, and forgive me, other people have heard me say this in the last couple of years for TFN. I don't want it to come across as flippant, but I believe it's real. I want a young person in Bradford growing up, or a young person in Salford growing up, to have better opportunities than their brothers, sisters or parents had. First of all, for education in a state secondary school, and secondly, having got better life skills and qualifications, then the ability to leverage higher value added jobs. And transport, Richard, is a connector. It's there for an economic purpose. It's there to close the gap as to why, as Northerners, on average, we're £5,000 a year worse off than if we lived in the south of England. That is because we don't have the opportunity to get the currency in education and skills to get those higher quality jobs, and then to get to where those jobs are. You know, the distance between Manchester and Leeds is not a lot different to the Central Line on the London Tube. A young person in London wouldn't think twice. I'm Pro-Chancellor of Brunel University. A lot of our students out near Heathrow at Brunel commute in from East London on a daily basis to go to university. You wouldn't think twice doing that down south. Up north, it's a lot harder to get across the Pennines. And the reason I use my Bradford and Salford analogies, and I could have used Newcastle and Carlisle or Hull and Chester analogies, if a young person in Bradford wants to do one of those fantastic digital jobs in an SME within 20 minutes walk of Piccadilly Station in Manchester, or a young person in Salford wants to do one of those fantastic professional consultancy or financial services jobs within 20 minutes of walk of Leeds Station, they've got to be able to get across the Pennines. And that's where the connectivity is so important. Of course, it needs to be, as you rightly say, Stephen, it needs to be low carbon connectivity. It needs to increasingly be electric and hydrogen. It needs to be helping mode shift from road freight to rail freight. But here's my killer stat. This is probably the most important thing. If we are enabled by government, and they've given us strong signs of in principle support, to build Northern Powerhouse Rail, which is an upgrade and new railway from Hull to Liverpool with a spur up to Newcastle, we would enable 10 million northern citizens to get to any four northern cities in 90 minutes by public transport. 10 million, 90 minutes by public transport. Today, only 2 million northerners can do that. And that explains, I think, in part, why there isn't as much GVA per capita and why productivity doesn't grow as fast at the moment. One comment on your report, which I think is an excellent report. I just make one additional comment. I've already alluded to it with starting with education before I got to transport. I'm also a board member of Ofsted. If you look at what's happening at the moment because of the pandemic in schools, we have lots of people missing out on opportunity that they really need, not being able to get into school, people with special needs and vulnerabilities not getting the sort of support that they would normally get because their carers and teachers aren't able to give it. That's going to take a generation to resolve, but I think it is a short-term problem as well of mental health, wellness, and people not falling into unemployment simply because they were in the wrong year, the year of 2020. And in your report, there's rightly a lot of emphasis on skills. As somebody who spent 35 years in the private sector, businesses think about skills because that's something we understand rather than education, which we tread carefully even to comment on. But I think a lot of what we do in apprenticeship and a lot of what we do in skills training is putting right things that didn't get done right first time in schools. And I think one of the big challenges in the North is helping to further improve school education in state schools and particularly state secondary schools to give people the chances that then other things like the zero carbon industrial strategy and better transport connectivity can really get them moving. I think I'll pause there.
John, thank you. I mean, it's such a fantastic set of things to think about. I think rather than making any of my own comments there, I'll look to the panel because I'm sure there'll be plenty of thoughts from that the panel would like to come in on. Stephen.
Yeah, so I agree with everything that John says, and he makes the case incredibly powerfully. I think one of observations just in particular about the potential way that work will change as a consequence of how we've had to change this last year and the kind of the sort of we've crossed the Rubicon in terms of the ability to do remote working certainly in the service sector and the professional services sector. And I think the question that's slightly unknown is what will be the new equilibrium we will return to when social distancing is taken out. It won't be what it was before. Equally, it won't be as we've been operating now. There'll be somewhere in between that will be a mixture of sort of office-based work, physical work in city centres, but also with people working more flexibly, more time working remotely, more hub and spoke models. And how that plays out over the coming years, I think, you know, we all need to kind of adjust to, and certainly in a kind of government policy sense, we'll need to be flexible and agile in responding to the market in that respect. I think one of the things for me, it kind of only emphasizes more is connectivity really does become important, because the types of commuting behavior that John was describing kind of across the Pennines, sort of the idea of doing it 5 days a week, 9 to 5, sort of, but still felt, you know, it was at the long end and the ambitious end. In a world where someone basically is only doing it 2 days a week or 3 days a week, actually that kind of access to a richer, deeper, wider labour market where people do travel still to work, but they don't have to travel as relentlessly and as frequently, may well really sort of accelerate some of that sort of behaviour change, and really sort of it changes the calculations on your transport modelling and your investment modelling. And I think we don't quite know exactly to the scale in a way, and often, you know, the challenge for us as government is our sort of backward-looking modelling won't necessarily be right to predict these changes because they'll be happening in real time. So I think that we need to reflect on that from our side, but I think how we do that as a community in thinking about that sort of changing how work will change in response to this, and what the opportunities and what it means for connectivity, I think will be really a sort of something we'll all need to be alive to.
I think those are super interesting points, Stephen, and as I'm sure many companies have found, we surveyed our staff a few times through the pandemic and found that, you know, there's certainly an appetite to take up more remote working, but not an appetite to work fully remotely forever, and that there's definitely a need for a place for teams and people to come together. So I thought as you described that, it does present a transport challenge, doesn't it? That's the same one that Sir John mentioned, but it becomes more about connectivity than capacity. If patterns change in the way you're suggesting, Stephen, which is still a very interesting, or becomes a very interesting challenge, different challenge than the one we've been used to for many years. Would anyone else on the panel like to come in on the transport?
Piers. I think Piers, you're on mute. You come on in.
Sorry, can you hear me?
And now,
obviously, violent agreement with Sir John and Stephen. I think very, very lucid and logical thinking. I think I've always favoured what used to be called HS3, now called Northern Powerhouse Rail. I've always favoured that over HS2 for two reasons. The first reason is that, as Sir John will know very well, the freight dimension with HS3 is very, very substantial. The amount of freight that could be taken off the road. You have sort of natural resources and ports all in the wrong places for dissemination through the region. Now, and then if you look at the region itself, I remember Richard Leese making this point. I think it's a really, really good point. Of all the regions of England, the north is very, very nicely configured with rail investments for a Randstad Rhine-Ruhr type approach. So that would be, you connect the region to itself, so that's more or less HS3, sorry, Northern Powerhouse Rail. You then connect it north-south with, so that's connecting the region to the rest of the country in Scotland through HS2, and you then connect the region to the world through Manchester Airport, which is already a first world airport. You can find there are 3 flights a day, or there used to be 3 flights a day to the Middle East and 4 flights a day, I think, to New York. So you can get to all points west through that route and all points east because of the Dubai being a hub. So that is a really good example of how spatial planning works in obviously quite simplified terms, but the opportunity of Northern Powerhouse Rail is, I think, quite extraordinary. But as Stephen says, it's going to be not 5 days a week, it will probably be 2 days a week. But if you live in Hebden Bridge, for instance, which is a very nice place to live, you could get to Hull or Liverpool very, very easily. At the moment, you can't. And that's right in the middle. So, you know, there is an enormous opportunity for Northern Powerhouse Rail, and it certainly has my full support.
Thank you, Piers. Just before we move on, I mean, thank you to John, Piers, Stephen, there for your contribution. That was some really interesting, thought-provoking stuff. Just an admin point. I don't think that for some reason the chat is working in Teams today, so apologies if anyone's feeling frustrated that they can't get their questions in. Gill and Emily at DevoConnect have asked me to ask you to either tweet them at DevoConnect or email info@DevoConnect, presumably .co.uk, with your questions, and we'll field them like that. So apologies if we have Teams does misbehave, doesn't it, occasionally, as they bring new versions out and it gets loaded up in the day. So we're experiencing a little bit of that. But anyway, we'll carry on with our fantastic panel. So thanks again. So John, I'd like to introduce now Kelvin Hollinrake, MP, co-chair of the Northern Powerhouse APPG, and Sasha Morgan, director of the Social Mobility Commission, who will be looking to respond now to part 3 of the report, Build, Skills and Housing. So Kevin, Sasha, the question to get us going is, do we need greater partnership between national, regional and local government and more devolved powers to get inclusive growth, placemaking and better connected places in the north? Or is it just about investment and more money?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Thanks for inviting me. I thought I was responding to the transport one, actually. So if I can, I'll just
very welcome to give your transport thoughts as well.
I mean, somebody who is, I've been an MP since 2015, and somebody who's campaigned at every election for a fairer deal for the North, I just see this as a huge opportunity for the North. And when suddenly we announce a levelling up strategy on the scale that we are currently implementing, we take it as a bit of a given. It was always going to be this way, and it's not at all. It's a massive, massive commitment. And I think, I don't want to talk politics really, but the politics are pretty useful here. This isn't just about levelling up, which we know we all want to see happen, have wanted for decades. But obviously the government's got some obligations in terms of trying to get, or some priorities in trying to do this, but also to get re-elected. And the fact that now you've got lots of seats it wants to retain in 2024 or whenever it is, I think is useful to make sure that the government delivers on its promises. And you know, I think, as John said before, and I agree with everything he said, this isn't just about the North getting payback for what it hasn't had for decades. It's not just about money. It's not just about trains and roads. It's about prosperity. And that's what we've got to deliver. People have got to see the tangible benefits in their back pockets. And this is going to, the scale of this is huge. It's a huge opportunity, but it's a huge task because of the decades of underinvestment. As we know, per capita, £1 being spent per capita in the north, to £3 being spent per capita in London and the South East for decades. And that's principally because the benefit cost ratio of investing in those regions is so much better. So if you've got jobs that are worth 40,000 a piece, 40,000 annual salary a piece, if you create 2,000 in one part of the country and those jobs are only 20,000 in another part of the country, where the benefit cost ratio of building a road or a railway is bound to look better in those areas like London and the South East, which is why the government's committed to changing that formula with something called the Green Book. And it's established, I mean, some really interesting quotes if you look at the Green Book review, and that underpins all these decisions in terms of where we invest our monies. But it says the Green Book currently risks undermining the government ambition to level up. There has been a failure to engage properly with the strategic context, and that includes things like levelling up on net zero. So this is absolutely fundamental. But the scale of this challenge is huge. The best analogy for the challenge of levelling up in the UK is probably the reunification of Germany. massive undertaking, East and West Germany. Obviously, a big difference in terms of their economic situations of those two parts of Germany. It took $2 trillion and 30 years to level those different parts of Germany, but they're still not level yet. So we've got to look at on that kind of scale. It's not about 4 or 5 years. This has got to be a 2 or 3 decades project. And the tangible examples that we've got at the moment is, you know, as John was saying, Blackpool is further away from London. Sorry, Blackpool is further away from Manchester than Brighton is from London. So it's nearer to Manchester than Brighton is from London. Yet it takes 25 minutes longer to get to Manchester from Blackpool, and the trains run 75% less frequently. So that's the kind of stuff we need. It's not just the big stuff like Northern Powerhouse Rail, it's also the smaller stuff, the smaller connectivity. So massive commitments from the government, 100 billion next year, 600 billion commitment to invest in infrastructure, the biggest infrastructure investment in 50 years. What we need around this is a strategic context, which is where this pan-northern infrastructure strategy fits in. Big opportunity there. The only thing I would say is, as Mark Littlewood said in an excellent piece he writes now in the Times, if this is all about connectivity, why isn't Doncaster more prosperous? Because Doncaster is hugely well connected by road, rail, air, but it's not very prosperous. So we've got to, at the same time, make sure this facilitates other types of investment, particularly from the private sector. So what I would like to see, as well as this huge investment in infrastructure, are some real incentives, just as they did in Germany, for businesses to relocate to start up in, to expand in the north and the Midlands particularly. So, and we do that through mechanisms like free ports, of course, which are a great concept, but also something else. I mean, free ports aren't that useful if you live somewhere in land like Darlington or Bishop Auckland, although not far away from the Teesside. But I would like to see super enterprise zones, the whole of the combined region of the Tees Valley, for example, be a super enterprise zone with tax breaks for investments, business rates discounts like you do on smaller scale now with enterprise parks. A national renewal fund. This is like a new 3i fund that the BGF, British Growth Fund, is trying to push, which would invest in businesses around the country, but that kind of a regional context. It's like an equity investment. I'd really like to see regional development banks, mutual banks like they have in Germany, that does have a patient capital approach for businesses who want to get established and grow in these regions. It would be a great thing to sit alongside devolution around a great mayor like Ben Houchin, of course, in Tees Valley. And really, it goes to the heart of this. When you're choosing projects, the private sector is better at allocating capital than government. So you better do that through incentives than you are through just throwing the cash around and hoping some of it pays back.
Kevin, thank you. Some really interesting analogies there. I don't think I'll be forgetting reunification of East-West Germany very quickly as the analogy. That's a great one. And the 2 trillion certainly lands as a point, doesn't it? Thanks. Thank you very much. I mean, would any of the panel like to comment on anything Kevin's said there? It was before we asked Sasha to come in. No, okay. So, Sasha, would you like to pick up perhaps the point on building skills and housing?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. I think that it's a really timely report, and I think as a Social Mobility Commission, we're really welcome being a part of this conversation. I think I was also taken by the analogy of East-West Germany, and I think there's a lot in it. For me, there's a big cultural question about how we create policy, and about the people who are involved in policy conversations and how that works, and particularly a culture that's built up in Whitehall. So I'll talk about a couple of different things. But I'll start by saying my context is that I was very excited to see the new national infrastructure strategy, because my role before I moved on to social mobility was as Chief Operating Officer at the National Infrastructure Commission, where I was really working with Sir John Armitt and before that Andrew Adonis on getting the first national infrastructure assessment done, about creating a strategy across our waste, water, broadband, etc. And the reason I started off by talking about this kind of what I see as a cultural divide in how policy is made, because part of your conversation was, to what extent do we need national and local government thinking differently? Do we need to be thinking about this? We have these very different cadres of social and public servants working on these issues. And in our own assessment on social mobility, we identified exactly what you were talking about, Kevin. We'd been talking to Marianne Sensier after she published her work on the industrial treasury and the suggested changes to the Green Book. And we knew that changes to the Green Book would be really critical to be unlocking things around poor social mobility. That said, infrastructure is the beginning, not end. And what I find is you've got clusters of policymakers who do the kind of productivity, the economic side of things. They talk about GDP in hard numbers. And somehow the conversation about transport and about broadband and about waste and about how we're dealing with water supply gets split away from people in super unhelpful ways. And so I think we do need to think about a culture of how our productivity conversations come much more closely. If you look at the first version of the industrial strategy, they barely got a mention of people in it. It was very, very difficult to basically bring those two elements together. And for me, if we're going to make significant strides, we're going to have to be thinking about this very, very differently. And so you pose the kind of the stimulus of thinking about skills. And I've been looking at apprenticeships policy, which we published this year, which is that, yes, we've increased the number of apprentices, but at every single stage of the apprenticeship journey, we know that young people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are not making it through the apprenticeship system. They're not being recruited into apprenticeships. They're not progressing off the lower levels of apprenticeships. They're not making it into high level apprenticeships. And the areas where the most disadvantaged young people live don't actually even have access to high level apprenticeships. Looking at progression out of low pay and what we need to do with employers. Again, we see massive differences about your chance of progressing out of low pay close to London. And we can see the parts of the country where you're least likely, and many of those areas are in the north. That said, I understand that this is a focus on the north, and that's where the focus of my thinking is today. But I'm really, really wary that we get into very strict north-south divides. If I look at the lists we've just done recalibration at looking at every single of the region of the UK. We took a cohort of 800,000 young boys who grew up in the 85, they came into the labour market in the last Great Recession, and then we tracked through their labour market earnings. We looked at the distinctions between what localities they were in the UK, and we could give a social mobility rating for every single local authority in the UK. And if I look at that list and I look through it and see who the best and worst are, at the very top of my list of low earnings for boys that are on free school meal families, I've got Chiltern. Underneath that, I've got Bradford, so I've got Yorkshire and Humber. I've got Hindburn, so I've got the northwest. I've got Gateshead, so I've got the northeast at number 4. Coming in at number 5 is Thanet in the southeast. Coming in at number 6 is Blackpool, northwest. Oldham, northwest. Bolton, northwest. Stockton-on-Tees, northeast. And then I go into the lower levels of that in Walsall, Wolverhampton. So I'm there in the West Midlands. So I think one of the big things I want to get to is not to, having moved away from a question where London is everything and London is all, I honestly don't want to get into a lazy conversation about how this is a north-south divide. It's just, it seems to be perpetuated by lazy journalists. And so I kind of think, let's be better than that. So whilst thinking about how we can do the very best for the north, remember we're an incredibly variegated country, and that the worst of social mobility is coming in patches all around our country, albeit with a really huge, I'd say the worst of our socio-economic outcomes are happening in a lot of the Midlands, and then of course in the north, with a different pattern in the northeast to the northwest. So for me, there is something about how we regionalise policy making from departments, particularly of Department for Education, but also DWP. So when we talk about apprenticeships policy, when we talk about FE reform, when we talk about how we are going to work with, and the conversation we're having with employers, we need to have a localized set of responses. And so to your overarching question, or whether it's just money, I'd say it's and money. You don't get there without money, but we've also got to get to a place where, you know, we move between a 5-year political cycle, which is unhelpful for these, because these are systemic entrenched issues. And like Kevin said, we all know when the wall fell down. That was 89. I was still in primary school. It's taken a long time for that to happen. This is going to take a long time, but the little pots of money being doled out by CLOG and by others into different bits of the country on really short leashes, 1 year, 3 years, opportunity areas, will they get a 5th year? We need consistent funding, and it needs to cut across pots. And it needs to be, if we're going to genuinely make progression on this localism agenda, we need to be thinking back. I know it's old terms, but we need to be thinking about pooled budgets. We need to be thinking about the period of funding so that people can do consistent, coherent work over a longer period of time. And we need to be really clear that the devolved money that comes from Europe, it's not that it just arrives and that we replicate what's going to replace that European funding, but we've just got to have much better methodologies. How could you have a towns fund that didn't even consider socioeconomic diversity or the worst cold spots in the country? That entire funding program for towns had no criteria. So we've got to get just better at our methodology. We've got to think on a slightly long-term basis, and we've got to get the bastions of policy making in transport and education thinking on a regional basis. And frankly, having an office in sanctuary buildings and education, thinking regionally is something they do after the case, after national policy is made, not before. I think we need a fundamentally different approach to how we do that. So that's my 5 pence worth.
Sasha, what a brilliant contribution. Thank you. I just wonder if any of the panel had wanted to comment on any of those, because there's so many sort of far-reaching points. Kevin, I'll
yeah, I mean,
and then
some
John.
fantastic points, Sasha. And one thing I wanted to mention, just in terms of the housing front, I mentioned the Green Book earlier, and but we have a similar formula that applies to something called the Housing Infrastructure Fund. So I think in your report, you're saying it's not just about getting more housing, it's getting more infrastructure. The way the Housing Infrastructure Fund works at the moment, there's an affordability context in there. So it means that 80% of the monies from the Housing Infrastructure Fund, which pays for the infrastructure that delivers the housing, goes to London and the South East. 20% for the rest of the country. It's and it's not even widely recognised that that's the case. So if we want the infrastructure, we don't need to revise the Green Book. There's lots of other things like the Housing Infrastructure Fund that we need to see a fairer bias to make sure that the money is spent more fairly throughout the country.
Thanks, Kevin. So, John, did you want to go next?
Yeah, just to say, and you very kindly knighted me in this seminar, and I'm really flattered, but I'm just a mere Mr. Cridland, and very happy to answer that.
Very much
I'm going to mention it, but given you so kindly keep repeating
Must be something I heard, John.
No way. That's fine.
It's on its way.
23 years ago, gosh, a very long time, I had the very great privilege of being a founder member of the Low Pay Commission. And Sasha, I just wanted to say I really buy your point about people being stuck in pockets of low pay and being unable to progress out of them. With cross-party support, I think the national minimum wage has been a very big success. It has got everybody up from the bottom to a certain degree. But when we had the 20th anniversary of the minimum wage, and we're always hyper self-critical, it made less progress. And if you look at the people who are at the bottom may be higher than it was 20 years ago, but broadly it's the same group of people at the bottom who were at the bottom 20 years ago. In other words, if you started your career in minimum wage jobs, it's very hard to get out of minimum wage jobs. If you ask the question, Richard, why that is, I think it has something to do with the changing nature of our labour market and industry in this country, in that a lot of the jobs we've lost in the north are in the middle of the income spectrum. They're skilled jobs in manufacturing skilled jobs of a traditional craft nature. We've created lots and lots and lots, which is fantastic, of relatively low paid leisure, retail and high street jobs. We've created lots and lots and lots of really high paid professional services and technical jobs. But if you haven't got the middle steps on the escalator, you can't get from the bottom towards the top very easily. And Sasha, I think the work on social mobility has to address, as you are doing, how to make that progression, which is why I tried to make my infrastructure comments in the context of how it would let a 16-year-old do something different in the North from what their parents were able to do.
Thank you, John. Stephen, would you like to come in? You've patiently got your hand up there on Teams.
Indeed, yeah. Now I'll happily come in, and I probably should start by sort of slightly defending ourselves as the people handing out pockets of money that Sasha refers to, and firstly to say the Towns Fund did have criteria on both income deprivation and skills, which guided ministers' decision making. But we don't have to get into a specific debate about that, because fundamentally I agree with your overarching point that kind of thinking about the social dimension, thinking about skills, education, access to work, kind of not looking at just the kind of maximal north-south, but looking at the kind of pockets of that, the neighbourhood level, all of that dimension is as important, if not more important. Kind of infrastructure is an enabler, it is not a solution. And I think the kind of really making sure our regional policy is as rooted in the levers that are held by the Department for Education, the Department for Work and Pensions, thinking about the incredibly important role that the kind of local government can play in supporting families, particularly those who are kind of struggling most, thinking about the importance of actually improving health outcomes. Actually, if you look across the North, health outcomes are particularly low. I think, in many ways, the last year has brought into sharp relief and demonstrates quite kind of starkly the sort of the kind of integration between health and the economy, and that will have to be a kind of ongoing legacy of how we design our public policy and think about not just put it in an economic policy group or a social policy group, but see the interlinkages. The sort of final thing I would say, and I championing this within government. Your point on kind of needing the civil service to kind of be of the community and be rooted in it is absolutely vital. I think the kind of I am pleased with some of the direction that's sort of happening in this space quite recently. So the commitment of government to move 22,000 civil service jobs out of London isn't the sort of the immediate benefit of providing job opportunities in other parts of the country is great. But I think the real long-term benefit from that will be to bring into the policy-making space different communities and different individuals and people with different backgrounds. And the thing I'm struck, just having a small team in government that has offices in eight places around the country, the debate about the importance of car parking is far more important in every other office around the country apart from the London. No one drives to the London office, and it's just it's a small example, but just your lived experience shapes what you focus on, where your policy priorities are, and how your advice is streamed. And so, I'm hoping in a few years' time, sort of northern exiles like me won't have to move to London just to forge a career in the civil service, but actually we will be able to bring a kind of richer, more grounded advice to shape and sort of equally servicing ministers who spend more time in and around the country as well. So, more to be done here, but I think the direction is positive.
Stephen, thank you. That's super interesting thoughts there about the value, the extra added value of moving those civil service and policy related jobs. I think you used the word rooted in the community, which I think I like that. as a picture. Sharon, could I come to you for some comments on any of the subjects we've taken, but particularly on Build Back Better, if you'd like to?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. Yeah, so I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Green Jobs Taskforce, which has recently been launched. I've recently been appointed to, just because it does tie into the work that's been done on this report quite well. In terms of the UK's target for net zero emissions by 2050, tracking back from that, it's anticipated that we could have around 2 million green jobs by 2030. And the focus of discussion so far has very much been about the technologies that would be required, the infrastructure investment, the capital required, and less talk generally about the skills that will be needed to actually fill and carry out that work with those new jobs. And so the actual, those 2 million green jobs being anticipated to be only 10 years away, the Green Jobs Task Force was set up to start now and to run until spring 2021 to develop an action plan to support the skills needed. There's 4 key areas there. The first one's the skills for a green economic recovery, which is what obviously we've talked a lot about this afternoon, what support we need in the short term to help people move into those green jobs. And really we're talking about over the next 18 months. There's also consideration of the pipeline of future skills and talent, and what longer term need do we have to build that workforce towards 2030. Having quality jobs that are sustainable and ensuring that we have a diverse workforce, and then also transition and retraining for high carbon workers, what skills we need to retain, what we can transfer. Just picking up on John's comments there on the loss of skilled traditional jobs, that ties in with that. So in terms of how this all relates to the Road to Recovery series and the findings, clearly the impact of COVID on the North and employment has made it even more crucial that we rapidly identify opportunities for green jobs and provide support for the skills required. So whilst our task force has been established to meet employment requirements for 2030, we must waste no time in tackling the first key area, which is the skills required for a green economic recovery, and particularly in the North. With regard to the question of partnership, we know that the North as a mega region shares common ambitions, strengths, challenges, and frustrations with historical London-centric investment. And it's well positioned to work together on this road to recovery, and it certainly has the will to do so. However, we also know that our individual regions have very different opportunities and risks. The industrial history of each area and the individual ways in which they've regenerated, their particular strengths of skills, training, education provision, and their opportunities for building developments all vary widely. And so for this reason, I think it's essential that local government has devolved power to make decisions about their local investments. Sasha's point about regional being the first consideration rather than the last, I think is absolutely critical here. And just picking up on a couple of the report's key findings, really interesting to see that the North is already leading the way in modern methods of construction, greater use of technology and innovation. This best practice should be highlighted and developed further. We can see that it's important to get new graduates into, in particular, the planning sector. I'm interested to find out more about what education institutions will need to ensure that pipeline of skills is coming through. We know that apprenticeships have suffered through COVID, and we know that they need further support. We've seen great initiatives here in Tees Valley under Ben Houchin, our mayor, to fund apprenticeship positions. And I think the reasons for greater partnerships and devolved powers, to go back to your original question, it's not just for relevancy and accuracy, but it's also for speed. We know that with devolved power, local leaders can act rapidly and decisively to recover quickly. And just finally, what I've noticed, and I've been considering reading the report, whilst the focus on the road to immediate recovery is really vital, we mustn't lose sight of this need for further long-term skills. It's really important we start work now on this pipeline of future skills and talent for net zero. And that means engagement with schools and families. It means quite careful management, I think, of the whole image of green jobs. Personally, from being involved in the announcement of the last 2 weeks of the Green Jobs Taskforce, it's shown me on social media, for example, a really broad range of views, and I've been quite shocked at the levels of negativity in some cases and the levels of ignorance in some cases about what these jobs are and could be. And I think there's a real need for education and to show that these are real employment sectors of the future, particularly with anybody who's influencing young people, so that we can make sure that they are genuinely inspired and motivated and encouraged to see these as valid career choices in their futures. And we just need to sow those seeds now. So I think we've got two routes with this. We've got this immediate requirement to work quickly, to work on the next 18 months and make sure that we can recover with the new green jobs that we have now. And we need to keep our eye on the horizon and make sure that we keep that pipeline of talent coming through for skills.
Sharon, thank you. Thank you for your thoughts and your contribution. I'm sure everybody's got lots of questions. Gill, I think given the time, should we move on to the Q&A, which I think you're going to curate for us at this point?
Okay, thanks, Richard. I mean, it's just amazing, thought leadership, I think, that's coming through. And I think regardless of the chat going a bit wonky, I am not bereft of questions. I'm just going to do a long list of from people who I know have a question. So we have on the line, we have Daniel Coughlin, who people will know from the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. We have Bill Walker, and he's got a specific question as well, and he's from Marketing Humber. My good friend Lord Stunnell, who will be no doubt asking a question around green recovery, and we have Penny, another question from Penny Marshall at Institute of Civil Engineers, ICE. Richard Blythe's been very active on the chat too, and we have Lauren from Electricity Northwest and Hannah at the CBI. I've got more, including Lord Inglewood, but let's see, there's an awful lot there. So could I start off in no particular order, but no, with Daniel first, because I think I personally would like to hear what he's got to say from a Northern Powerhouse Partnership view on all those things: net zero, transport, housing, building and skills. So yeah, Daniel, are you there? Yep, here we go. Okay. Well, we're waiting. There was a question which I could actually read out his question if you're not there, Daniel. No, I'm not getting anyway. So one question we had here was, we've seen some commitment from the Chancellor to levelling up in yesterday's spending review with the Green Book. That's one for you, Kevin. Green Book reform and infrastructure bank particularly welcome being based in the north. Is there a risk in particular with the announcement of the 4 billion levelling up fund for projects that must be funded in this Parliament, that a long-term ambition of the Northern Powerhouse to fundamentally address some of the long-term inequalities in areas like education, health, etc., may never be realised? So that's one from Daniel. I'm sorry, Daniel, if you are there and you can't come in. I might leave that one there, and I will come back to you, Kevin and John, and probably others if they want to come in. I'm going to try and see if we're a bit more successful on the next one, which is Bill Walker from Marketing Humber. Bill, are you there? I can see you're there, but can we hear you?
Hello, Jill. Yeah, can you hear me?
we can hear you. Great. Over
Excellent. That's good. Some excellent stuff this afternoon. Thank you very much to all the panel. Some really good stuff. My specific question, of course, was on this part of the north, because decarbonisation is the most significant challenge and, of course, the greatest opportunity for the Humber. 12.4 million tonnes a year, the estuary's industrial cluster emits more CO2 than any other UK cluster, and in fact, it's the same as Teesside, Merseyside, Grangemouth and Southampton all put together, or internationally, it's equivalent to the whole of the country of Kenya. So put simply, the UK will be unable to hit its net zero targets without an effective response in the Humber. And giant businesses like Ørsted, Siemens Gamesa, Equinor, Drax, Centrica, British Steel, among others, all recognise this and are investing heavily in establishing green solutions like hydrogen, CCS, etc. And of course, this region is also host to the world's largest offshore wind farms. But politically, the Humber is miles behind the established mayoral and devolved authorities, and I'm not sure if the scale is even recognised across the northern Powerhouse partners, even though actually the UK government actually does get the Humber. So how would the panel suggest that business organisations like Marketing Humber work most effectively and collaboratively through the forthcoming political vacuum to ensure that the Humber can deservedly be showcased at COP26 as an exemplar region of global importance, so that significant private sector investment can then be followed by sustainable skills, green jobs, and the real social change that we need?
That's an excellent question, and again, very thought-provoking. Of course, within everything, we've got to remember the 10-point plan. Again, the key point, is it going fast enough? The point that was made there is really, there is a very much an immediate, now, soon, later, requirement here, but decarbonisation is key. I'm going to bring in, next, I'm bringing in Penny Marshall, if you're there with your question that you put on the Twitter, Penny, and probably Richard. Penny from ICE, are you there? No.
Jill, can I just tackle the last point before you move on to the next question? Is that possible?
Yeah, no, just dig in while we're...
A couple of things, just on Dan's question about the Levelling Up Fund. That's a different fund from the wider capital spending, 100 billion spending next year. Therefore, the Levelling Up Fund is a smaller pot of money that's to be bid for over the next Parliament for a smaller infrastructure, bypasses, and for reshaping town centres and the like. So it's a slightly different pot of money. So it's the Green Book will apply mainly to that, I would guess, to both pots of money, both the main capital spending limits on infrastructure and in terms of the Levelling Up Fund. In terms of the last point about the Humber, well, I would say to the people of the Humber is get yourself an elected mayor, get yourself a devolution settlement, get some real leadership into that area. You know, Yorkshire has been really obviously lagging behind in terms of devolution for many reasons. I'm fully behind the concepts of city regions for devolution. I think it's great that Sheffield's got one. I'm sure Leeds will come in the pipeline. New York now has. Hull should have as well. You get a real inspirational character who could draw all those businesses together and bring government in and bring finance in to deliver those solutions to get to net zero as quickly as possible, with the support of a key person, a key leader. Yeah,
I'm bound to say I thoroughly agree with you, Kevin, as always, but we need more devolution. Very big part of the Levelling Up agenda. Didn't seem to have got Penny either, but what she did say was, I fully endorse everything that has been said so far. The point about validity of current transport models in the new normal is very well made. So well done, John Cridland. But do the panel members think this is being recognised by the DFT? That might be a quick response from you, John.
So I wouldn't want to take credit for Stephen's excellent comment, because it was Stephen who said, yeah, great plans, Cridland, but how do they relate to the changing patterns of work. And I agree, Stephen, with your answer that every time we think technology is removing the need for travel, what it actually does is change the nature of travel, which is what you said. And the pendulum will swing. It won't swing back to where we started. There will be more home working, but that provides the opportunity for more value added travel. And it's the value added travel that helps people lead more enriched lives on higher incomes in the north. So I think there is a way of doing that. I think the honest answer to the question, though, Gill, is we're very much in the foothills of working out what the consequences of the pandemic are. We need a bit more time for things to settle down, to get through the immediate crisis. So I also chair the Home Group, which is one of the country's biggest housing associations. We have 2,500 staff. We are still working from home because at the moment, other than customer-facing staff who need to be in local communities, our office-based staff, we're not reopening our offices at the moment, but we're keeping it very much under review. So it's a changing field, but we need a bit more time to work out what it will mean in the long term. Yeah,
I agree again. So Stephen, you've got your hand up, and so have you, Sasha. So be interested to hear what you've got to say.
Three quick things on the comments so far. We are in the foothills, as John says, but DFT are part of that conversation. I had a meeting with my DFT equivalent where we were talking about this last week. So there's work to be done looking forward, but it is part of the conversation. The kind of, it relates to the sort of refresh of the Green Book, and we've talked about that in various moments. I think one of the things that is most interesting in the kind of detail of what was announced yesterday is a recognition of trying to think kind of, the system to date looks at projects and appraises individual projects where nothing else changes. And often the reality in all of the stuff we've been talking about today is how the system is changing and how do you need a combination of skills, housing, industry, investment, innovation, transport, and the sort of how do you think about multiple things changing at once and the transformative impact those things can happen. It makes the job harder doing the appraisal, but actually, if we can crack that, I think that will make a big difference in stacking up business cases, because actually it's where the kind of these things need to come together rather than individually. The final thing just on the devolution point. So we had hoped to be publishing a devolution white paper in 2020. Things have got in the way somewhat in 2020, but the plans are in place to come forward with that in 2021, and our ministers are and have been having various discussions with politicians in and around the sort of Humber region. As you rightly recognise, though, Bill, the sort of the opportunities of decarbonisation in the Humber, the kind of messages that went into the work that was the kind of development of the local industrial strategy. That we absolutely recognise that in government, and the commitment of up to £1 billion for decarbonisation for industrial clusters, the kind of places like the Humber, but alongside that, you name the other estuaries where this is central. These are going to be the types of places that will benefit from that investment.
Okay, thank you, Stephen, and Sasha and Piers, you've got your hands up. I'm going to try and endeavour to bring in 2 more questions and then quickly round up. So as brief as you can now, so we can get as much in.
My quick thing, I found it fascinating, the question, and I'm just very interested by the kind of the potential that organisations like Centrica and British Steel doing investments in an area like the Humber means, and it's kind of at the top of some of our lists for the lowest earning. My concern is about how internal migration and opportunity works. And I was really kind of impacted by Stephen talking about his kind of, I'm not sure if it was lonely, but his journey as a northern lad who wanted to change public policy, having to travel to the big the big metropolis. And I think that what worries me as we create opportunities in the Humber, and if we want to create transformative green jobs, who gets them? So what our work has shown is that generally speaking, internal migration means that those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds move to where the jobs are, and those who are locally based don't often get a look in. And so my concern to be considered into the development process of whatever happens in that space is how you consider that those from routine and manual working class backgrounds are given access to any jobs that open up. So one thing, we have to create the jobs and we have to create the space, and we need that connectivity between employers understanding, but we also need to make sure who's coming through, where have they come from, or have we just imported a load of bright young grads who used to be in the south? Or indeed, when we count our numbers and recognise that maybe 40% of the workforce is indeed from the region, who are they? And are we genuinely spreading the wealth? So if I think that kind of understanding of who's in your workforce, where they are from, and figuring out who's progressing. When we see people from equal socioeconomic backgrounds going into the workplace, within 5 years, there's a 20% pay gap between people from working class backgrounds and people from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. We can create the jobs in the north, but there are equally wealth disparities already in the north. There are very well-off people in the north, and there are incredibly people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. Can we make sure it's not simply about jobs in the north, but jobs for whom?
Yeah, that's a great point. And Piers, quickly, and I'm just going to try if Andrew Stunnell, you're there, and Richard Blythe, just very quick questions, but Piers, very quickly as well.
Very quickly, the answer to Humber is get a mayor. The answer to Dan is, it's really, there are endless pots of money. There's a shared prosperity fund, there's the towns fund. This all needs to be put together into a single-minded proposition. There needs to be a plan, a spatial plan that understands skills and education as much as the infrastructure issues. The plan needs to be worked up, ideally by Sir John Armitt's outfit, which is extremely good. We're already talking to them. And the plan then needs to be enacted through a representative body, which include mayors. That is the secret for devolution. Devolution based upon a plan for the mega regions is the mechanism that we're going to address all of these issues in a clear-sighted and transparent way.
Fantastic. So Lord Stunnell, Andrew Stunnell, are you there for a quick question? We also had a question from Lauren at Electricity Northwest regarding, what businesses can do, really more business can do to actually respond to electric, on the decarbonisation front in terms of electric vehicles and the ambitions there. I don't know if anybody wants to, maybe again, John, you might have a view on how electric vehicle infrastructure, comes into the whole big plan of recovery, but we mustn't forget that, because that's the other big thing. It's not just about decarbonising housing, it's obviously decarbonising transport, and that's a big ambition there from government. Anything there? I think what we'll do, Richard, on the basis that people aren't coming back to me, that I'll come back to you to have the final word and maybe pick up on some of the points from our excellent panel. Okay.
Yeah, I think, Jill, thank you. And look, we've perhaps struggled with the chat things, hopefully, but I mean, we've heard plenty from the panel. I'd just like to say a really big thank you to all the members of the panel for just, I've got like 4 pages of notes here. I think it's just it's such brilliant input and thought, and just to recap on a couple of those points, and Stephen's great point about the pattern of travel and connectivity, what that means for connectivity versus capacity. So John, who's not here, I should apologise for getting his title wrong. John, so I really enjoyed your comments on the the DFT, how they rate things for economic connectivity, not just passenger corridor connectivity. And if we enabled for MPR 10 million people, average of 4 northern cities, what a tremendous difference that would make. The Sheffield-Cumbria connection, that was a really fascinating point. Kevin, you're reflecting on what a massive win the sort of levelling up focus and the commitment and the commitments to funding really is, and I think that's a great point to make. That wasn't a given, was it? And the commitment to that is fantastic. It's not about roads and railways and payback; it's about prosperity. I thought that was a great comment. The poor old Green Book got a bit of a beating as usual, didn't it? And if I reflect, that it is difficult, isn't it, to get a methodology that applies to bring to trying to justify a roundabout in your local roads, as well as justifying HS2. It is difficult to get one methodology for all that. So that is something that needs a coat of looking at. Reunification of East-West Germany took 2 trillion and 30 years and still isn't, and there's still a bit to do. So that puts maybe the scale of the challenge and the need to keep on keeping on. Sasha's great points as well about it's not just north-south, is it? It's about social mobility. Is that just lazy journalism characterising it as simply north-south? Regionalising decision making, make it first, not the last thing in what some of our departments look at. And then Sharon, great comment about the 2 million green jobs by 2030 and what a skills challenge that is. That really stuck out to me. So look, to the panel and everyone who's listened, thank you very much for your time and your contribution. I'd really like to thank actually Gill and Emily from DevoConnect, and that's for setting this up and taking us through this whole series that's enabled us to build to this point. So thank you very much. And some of the key contributors from my own teams, Laurie, Viral Desai, Dr. Vicky Hutchins, John Judds, Richard Bailey, Jason Pavey and Stuart McLaren and others. So thank you to those guys as well for all the contribution they've made. Thank you to everybody for listening today, and I hope you found that really useful. I think we had a great session with the panel here, so thank you.
Yeah, and thank you very much, Richard, and thank you, Sasha, John, Bill, Sharon, Stephen, and Kevin, and of course Piers. All right, and thanks very much. Okay, thanks, Richard.
Thanks all.